My grandpa dug a pond 70 years ago, and I'm witnessing Cindy Lockage order 12 tons of concrete to be put into it, totally ignorant that she's about to cut. She stands there feeling like someone who just won the globe. 180 homes' water supply will be cut off in 48 hours when all of the faucets run dry. Tell me where you're viewing from. And the self-appointed local hero will see what true consequences look like. Only you will understand how delicious this retaliation is if you have ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA president. It began on a typical Tuesday as I was watering my garden, which was the same calm routine I had been doing for 15 cents my divorce released me from ongoing turmoil years ago. I usually spoke while holding my grandfather's fading photo next to me. The pond, a practice that likely makes me appear like the oddball in the area. Yet another peaceful day, Grandpa. I mumbled to the old photo that I don't really care what others think anymore. I am an engineer who works part-time. I inherited this house and all of my grandfather's technical documentation, so I know that when Cindy Lockage marched across my yard with 2 HOA lackeys following her. The pond wasn't simply landscaping. She donned a Navy work suit and an enormous HOA president, just like anxious students do when they follow their principal, insignia that resembled an Olympic item, and she exuded the confidence of someone who had recently taken after 6 months in government. She believed she ruled the little country. The woman had that unique Mr. Henderson. She combines hazardous ignorance with good intentions to create spectacular tragedies. Declared that this pond causes unhygienic circumstances in that schoolmarm voice that likely scared pupils for decades. We're planning to fill it in and construct a secure playground where kids can truly play without worrying about mosquito breeding grounds. Play without endangering my health. I looked at her face and recognized someone's appearance. She had already determined that she was rescuing the world from impending catastrophe. And it was because of her unquestioning conviction that, Miss Blockage, you made her so deadly. I calmly responded, this pond has been here. My grandpa has been excavating it since 1952 for a very precise technical reason. Might have discussed the water collecting system, subsurface canals, and delicate balance at that very moment. That kept our community running. But instead I saw her erect her shoulders like a teacher addressing. I recognize that you're a challenging parent who just doesn't know what's best for their child. Mr. Henderson, I have an emotional attachment to the past, but as president of the HOA, I have to put safety first, putting contemporary norms over emotion and antiquated ideas. Here's what our beloved Cindy was unaware of, purposefully opted not to inform her that this pond served as the focal point for the whole water distribution system in our area. Network. I recalled my grandfather bringing me out here at the age of 8 to explain how rainwater accumulated in the pond and channeled into subterranean conduits that provided water to the 4 major wells that served each of our homes. He pointed to the seemingly straightforward water feature, saying, "Community is the heart of this whole place, son." Like pioneers, we would all be lugging buckets from the creek, and I had preserved his hand-drawn engineering notes, schematics, and thorough explanations of the system's operation. One phone call may have averted the catastrophe that was approaching, but there was something about Cindy's utter conviction and rejection of any chance that she could be incorrect led me to allow her to learn about consequences in the instructive manner that she documented for 20 minutes. It seemed as though she was constructing a case for the Supreme Court from every angle. This wasn't some impetuous authority trip. The woman was a careful professional who was sincerely certain that, despite my fear of what was ahead, I had to appreciate her thoroughness in safeguarding the community from a real health concern. When she arrived, the 2 board members nodded like bobbleheads on a dashboard. Obviously scared by her qualifications and corporate efficiency, I saw Betty Campbell's concern when she occurred to stroll by, and saw this examination. Betty's father had shared some of the neighborhood's history with her, so she knew something about it. The ancient tales. But she was also aware that Cindy was acting like a steamroller and wouldn't value disruptions that night. I tried one more time to stop the impending catastrophe by writing a brief little letter and placed it beneath her door. Miss Lockage, please understand that this pond has greater significance than you may have thought. Examine its initial intent before making any permanent changes. A worried neighbor who wanted to assist the next morning, I saw her find my warning and read it with obvious annoyance through my kitchen window, disregarding it like someone throwing away a chain letter. She crumpled it up and threw it directly into her trash can. She mumbled aloud from a conspiracy theorist using anonymous intimidation techniques. Sufficient for me to hear via my open window that I'm a professional with education who bases choices on scientific. She dismissed local rumors and superstitious nonsense in favor of facts and community safety regulations. With the contented demeanor of someone who has just disposed of an imagined dust, she walked back inside her home after bothersome diversion, at which point I was very convinced of what was going to occur, and I began getting ready for cameras for the instructional film I was going to make, and Cindy Lockage was going to sign up for the most. Cindy spent the whole week handling this pond removal endeavor as though it were the most costly education of her life. Through my window, I observed her working through the night to prepare what appeared to be a business merger. Presentation fit for a Fortune 500 boardroom, and the woman wasn't hurrying into anything. She truly thought her commitment was evident in the extensive research she was doing and the well-informed choice she was making that would benefit everyone. There is something both terrible and even noble about it. If only she had bothered to ask the proper people the appropriate questions. And amazing to see someone put in so much effort into their own dramatic demise, particularly when the community gathering on Thursday night changed our lives, and they're doing it with the best of intentions. Local clubhouse into Cindy's private TD speaking space, which she had set up as though she were defending her doctorate thesis. Wearing a white shirt with graphs and charts shown at the front. Would provide professional satisfaction to a health inspector, as she displayed a series of charts and medical citations that would cause any health inspector, including the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, to nod in agreement. Control stagnant water that doesn't flow presents real health hazards to the elderly and children. I visited the back row like a student doing an audit of a class that I knew would be a total failure, taking thorough notes and seeing my neighbors' reactions as they took in her captivating yet woefully inadequate presentation. About 65% of the audience fully accepted Cindy's rational presentation. She had obviously done a great deal of research on liability problems and health standards. Her explanation made perfect sense to those who were unaware of the crucial infrastructure that was hidden. I could hear Mrs. Patterson whispering to her husband, "My grandmother always, under that naive-looking pond in the front." Claimed that the pond had a significant connection, but her husband shushed her with a humiliated gesture. "Martha, you know how these professionals respond to that kind of conversation. So don't start with the old wives' tales." Stood up at that moment. Had I given them my grandfather's engineering records and described the subterranean water system, it might have prevented everyone's impending headache. But instead I kept quiet. As I saw this, I reasoned that if I spoke up now, the educational train crash would play out in slow motion. She will just write me off as a sentimental old guy who is incapable of accepting essential advancement. But if I led her to the awful beauty of it was that Cindy was going to learn a valuable lesson about the perils of making assumptions about other people. Comprehend complicated circumstances more fully than you can. When Betty attempted to voice valid concerns, she said, "Miss, since Lockage Pond has played a significant role in the history of our area, maybe we could." Cindy answered with the patient, "Look into its original engineering purpose before making permanent changes." A professor's disdain while correcting a well-intentioned but misinformed pupil. We truly value everyone's sentimental ties to local customs, Mrs. Campbell, but we just can't let sentimentality cloud scientific judgment when children's safety is at stake. Balance proudly pointed to her presenting materials, saying, "I've done a lot of research. This advice is founded on scientific data about public health rules and contemporary community planning standards, data and industry best practices rather than on old feeling or local legend," which she wasn't attempting to be unkind. She just thought she was right all the time. After the meeting, I went up to Cindy. "Miss Lockage," I remarked as we made one last effort to stop the impending disaster in the parking lot. I truly appreciate what you're doing to ensure the safety of our community. As tactfully as possible, however, before making any permanent changes, you might want to investigate certain engineering elements of that pond's operation. Adjustments. She gave me the patient, a little worn-out face of a teacher addressing a worried but foolish parent who just lacks perspective. Mr. Henderson, thank you very much for your advice. However, I've spent weeks studying this matter from every possible perspective. She responded with the exhausted patience of someone who has obviously had this discussion previously, since I've examined City Health Department safety codes, examined liability issues and the long-term prospects of our community. Growth requirements. I just can't let tailies and sentimentality take precedence over facts. Approach and professional knowledge. Her conviction was so total that I nearly felt bad for what I was going to do because of her sincere and unwavering faith in her own thoroughness, her reputation and self-assurance. Betty had lingered after the meeting, and that evening we sat on my front porch. Her clear worries, and I could see the creases of anxiety growing around her eyes. Something about this whole situation feels wrong to me, she remarked softly as she settled into the antique wicker chair. She shared with me the specifics of the pond that her father had recalled but that no one else could recall. The people who created these systems and comprehended how they work are losing their memory in the neighborhood. I replied very carefully. We never adequately recorded their wisdom for the following generation, and the most of them have now left. Betty agreed. Gradually realizing more than what I was stating outright. What occurs when you lose that type of what she inquired about? I turned to see the pond where my grandfather's engineering marvel was still quietly working, maintaining the operation of our community. I suppose we're going to find out soon. That evening, I obtained my grandfather's 1952 original plans, construction photos, and comprehensive engineering details about the pond's incorporation into the water infrastructure of our community. One glance at the technical requirements in these documents might put an instant stop to this whole problem. Cindy's explanation for the pond's existence and the consequences of removing it, however, if I step in now, she won't ever learn the important lesson of making decisions without conducting adequate research and conversation. She would just believe that she had been spared a small PR issue rather than causing a relive. Discovered that some individuals can only comprehend a humanitarian disaster that would impact every family in our neighborhood. Specific facts from first-hand experience rather than justification. And Cindy Lockage was about to receive a highly Thursday morning came with pricey instruction on the distinction between being thorough and being informed. At precisely 7 a.m., professional construction equipment rumbles like thunder, signaling the arrival of a storm. Something only I saw coming. Cindy had chosen a respectable business with the required licenses and insurance, not some after conducting a fly-by-night operation that takes shortcuts and probes. She stood there overseeing in a spotless white business attire, exuding the contentment of someone who had meticulously arranged every aspect to complete perfection. With Cindy, this was a communal improvement effort for the greater good, not a destructive project. I carried a handheld and wore a covert recording device while positioning cameras at various strategic angles. Camera to document this devastation from all angles. It wasn't just about obtaining ammo for some. The purpose of the petty vengeance scheme was to record what occurs when well-meaning intentions clash. With I stood motionless beneath my old gardening hat 30 feet away, displaying catastrophic ignorance. Recording as the excavator started methodically tearing down 70 years of meticulous engineering with each shovelful, though no one else realized it yet. It felt like a stab to my heart and the heart of our entire community. After 40 years of surviving winters, summers, storms, and the progressively murky water, goldfish swam wildly. Toys discarded by kids now faced death beneath the icy concrete, where the fish formerly lived. Been the proud offspring of the first pair my grandfather had brought in when the pond was brand new, and when the neighborhood was young. People were running around in a panic as their whole world practically fell apart around them. Like Cindy walked across the construction zone like a general, and our neighborhood would soon learn that this was happening to them. Overseeing a vital military operation, verifying safety procedures, and making sure everything went in line with her carefully thought-out requirements. She told the expanding group of people, "Every shovelful brings us closer to a safer, more modern community environment." As the interested neighbors came to watch this momentous change, she stood there thinking she'd just completed the most significant task during her presidency, which in her opinion was shielding kids from illness and liability while developing a stunning new park that will benefit families for many years to come. The construction crew proceeded with meticulous precision, initially using industrial pumps to drain the majority of the water. Then I kept my cameras running while I started the meticulous process of filling the hollow with tons of gray concrete, as 12 tons of everything my grandpa had constructed that had subtly supported our community was gradually buried by cement for 7 decades. Few neighbors who had stopped to observe made casual remarks, but the majority of locals were unaware of it. Remarks on how good it would be to have a suitable playground for their kids, and how they are finally getting rid of that mosquito pond. Children. An old woman standing next to me whispered softly to her friend, "I suppose that was simply old wives' stories, but my mother used to tell me that a pond was dug for some sort of water system." "Don't say things like that too loudly, Martha. You know how these HOA types are?" Her buddy shushed her with an uncomfortable giggle. I wanted to turn back and inform them both that Martha's mother had been completely correct, that they were seeing the devastation of their own water source, but I continued to record and count down instead. When the concrete was being poured, the hours until reality would overpower whatever justification I could provide almost finished. I moved to Cindy's command position while continuing to record with my handheld camera to record this moment. I added, "Miss Lockage for posterity," making sure my voice could be heard on the recording. "Do you know why my grandpa created this pond in the first place?" She gave me that look, intended for sentimental elderly guys who just cannot accept that communities and times must change to meet contemporary standards. "Mr. Henderson, I'm sure it had some usefulness in 1952, but she responded that we now live in a new period with various safety regulations and liability worries. Trust of someone who has carefully examined all the factors. We cannot permit sentimentality and emotional." I slowly nodded in order to avoid crucial safety enhancements that safeguard our most vulnerable citizens. 8 hours after I informed her of this choice, I made sure my camera recorded her complete conviction and satisfaction, gazing straight into her confident eyes with the serene assurance of someone who was fully aware of what was about to happen. "And you will learn the exact reason my grandfather built this pond and why it has existed for exactly 48 hours. She seems truly perplexed by my calm prognosis for 70 years, very likely assuming that I would be upset or distressed about losing this treasured family icon that had clearly outlived any potential practical utility it could have had. 8 hours for what, precisely?" she inquired, her authoritative tone tinged with interest as she attempted to ascertain what sort of desperate treat or pointless gesture I could have been contemplating. I didn't give direct responses, instead continuing to record as the last what had formerly been a vibrant ecology that provided water for our entire neighborhood was smoothed over by concrete. I eventually turned off my camera, started to walk back, realizing what unintended consequences really meant. I could hear Cindy talking about my mysterious situation. As I was heading home, burdened with the knowledge of what was going to happen behind me. Caution, with one of her board members presumably questioning what sort of innocuous demonstration an elderly guy could possibly stage. She was unaware that she had just deactivated the Community Improvement Initiative, which was expertly carried out, lifeline for our whole community, or that she would provoke a catastrophe to get more leadership experience. That night, I sat in my grandfather's study, learning more responsibility than any business school curriculum could possibly impart. He revealed a page in his leather-bound notepad that I had read several times but had never quite understood until now. "If this system is ever damaged, the water would vanish." As he meticulously wrote in his engineer's handwriting, after 48 hours, Not due of a mechanical issue, but rather because we had forgotten how to ask each other a straightforward I closed my notepad and gazed out at the concrete slab where life-giving water was located, wondering why this existed. Dot had flown for 7 decades. I said to his picture, "Grandpa, she's going to have to learn that lesson the hard way." Within the first 24 hours following the birth, I just hope the rest of us can survive her education. Hardened so silently that I began to doubt my own time. Estimates, perhaps the subterranean water system was more robust than I had anticipated. Perhaps my grandfather's engineering had included protections that would postpone the impending collapse. But precisely 18 hours after devastation, Maple Street resident Mrs. Patterson phoned the HOA emergency number Toby Day 2. She was complaining about her kitchen sink's strangely low water pressure. When almost half of the community lost access to water for everyday needs, residents began hauling buckets and pleading for every drop. Cindy responded to these early concerns in the manner of a capable administrator would have if she had gotten in touch with the HOA board, and the local water department convened an urgent meeting and created a methodical procedure for homeowners to report water-related issues that she was attempting to resolve, anything without realizing she was the reason. But what really struck me was how committed she was to finding answers instead rather than preserving her reputation as the problem. Grew out of control. What began as small annoyances swiftly turned into real problems as the degradation increased. At an alarming rate, struggles that made my cozy suburbia neighbors more like survivors of natural disasters. I observed from my window as families started the degrading custom of begging acquaintances, while carrying buckets and containers and family members for water to satisfy basic daily needs. Children were unable to take appropriate showers, and senior citizens struggled to meet basic hygienic demands, and young families were forced to limit their access to drinking water. The picture of Emma Patterson, 7, carrying a water bucket after a natural disaster, broke my heart. Despite the fact that the bucket was too large for her tiny hands, she didn't gripe after those 4 blocks with her grandma, who had previously chastised me for maintaining that antiquated pond were now looking in forlorn hope toward my house. As Betty Campbell was one of the first to realize that they were waiting for a miracle that would allow them to resume their regular lives. Link between our water issue and the devastation of the pond, which she had grown up hearing about from her father's tales about the neighborhood's early growth, and she vaguely recalled as bringing up the pond, being incorporated into the well system. She showed up at my home on Thursday night with a distressed look, and Ash remarked softly as she settled into the ancient porch, "Walt." A plastic water jug that symbolized her family's daily quota, chair, in which my grandpa formerly sat. I've been considering what my father used to say on the history of that pond. Is there a link between Cindy's actions and the state of our water supply? I examined her grizzled face for a while, realizing that this was the crucial time at which I had to decide whether to terminate Cindy. Stated that either education should be started early or it should be allowed to come to a disastrous end. Carefully, she will believe she nearly went into trouble rather than that she just wrecked a whole system if I save her now, with the insight of someone who has seen decades of local politics. Betty examined my expression and personal tragedies, but Walt, the old inhabitants are suffering while innocent people do not. It is not necessary for families with little children or those with health issues to learn this lesson about naturally. She was entirely correct about the individuals who were carrying the weight of Cindy's conceit, were helpless victims who relied on their HOA leadership to make wise choices, and I was permitting their pain to proceed in order to educate one individual about the repercussions of acting without sufficient knowledge, even if I am aware that Itzy told Betty that I was selfish. But certain lessons can only be learnt by bearing the whole burden of their Cindy won't fully comprehend the repercussions if I step in too soon. When she refuses to answer questions, she has the power to ruin. That night, I sat next to my grandfather's picture and carried out the most challenging internal discussion of this whole situation. "Grandpa, are I acting appropriately here? These decent folks are going through a lot of suffering because I'm attempting to educate Cindy about the risks of presuming UI watched as neighbors helped one another while I gazed at the concrete slab where life-giving water had flowed. Carry water bottles in the encroaching darkness. And the neighborhood was coming together in ways I hadn't witnessed in a long time. However, by the end of day 2, Cindy, that solidarity had emerged from a situation that I could resolve with a single phone call, was putting in 18-hour stints in an effort to communicate with local authorities and find answers for our neighborhood. City Water Department checked their main distribution pipes and discovered an unexplained water scarcity. The regional utility company had examined its infrastructure and found that everything was operating within normal bounds. Discovered no systemic issues in their network, and everyone expert she spoke with gave the same perplexing response. Since there was no obvious issue with the municipal water supply, something had to be the cause of the situation. I saw her pacing wildly in her living room via my window. Was close to our neighborhood. Till almost midnight, most likely in an attempt to solve a riddle that, if she couldn't discover the solutions to, would ruin her reputation. Her light soon remained on into 2 in the morning, and I could see her figure retreating and forth like an animal in a cage, yearning to get out, and I wanted to march over there and put an end to her suffering instantly. But I also realized that tomorrow would be the day she would have to confront the full extent of she would learn more about leadership from that encounter than from any classroom or textbook ever could. So I made the heartbreaking decision that tomorrow would be the day I had to put an end to both our suffering and disclose the truth, regardless of whether she would learn the desired lesson about accountability and the fatal consequences of day 3. Brought the type of urgency that changes cozy suburban life into certainty without knowledge. Communities into disaster-like areas, with 58 of 80 homes being 21 more, experienced low pressure for less than an hour and are now totally without water. Every day, and only a small number of homes at the far end of the community continued to experience anything like normalcy. Service. I observed how my neighborhood changed from a thriving middle-class neighborhood to what appeared to be a camp for refugees, with families traveling there many times a day to borrow water. If this system is ever damaged, the water would vanish. As he meticulously wrote in his engineer's handwriting, after 48 hours, not due of a mechanical issue, but rather because we had forgotten how to ask each other a straightforward I closed my notepad and gazed out at the concrete slab where life-giving water was located, wondering why this existed. Had flown for 7 decades. I said to his picture, "Grandpa, she's going to have to learn that lesson the hard way." Within the first 24 hours following the birth, I just hope the rest of us can survive her education. Hardened so silently that I began to doubt my own time. Estimates, perhaps the subterranean water system was more robust than I had anticipated. Perhaps my grandfather's engineering had included protections that would postpone the impending collapse. But precisely 18 hours after devastation, Maple Street resident Mrs. Patterson phoned the HOA emergency number Toby Day 2. She was complaining about her kitchen sink's strangely low water pressure. When almost half of the community lost access to water for everyday needs, residents began hauling buckets and pleading for every drop. Cindy responded to these early concerns in the manner of a capable administrator would have if she had gotten in touch with the HOA board, and the local water department convened an urgent meeting and created a methodical procedure for homeowners to report water-related issues that she was attempting to resolve. Anything without realizing she was the reason. But what really struck me was how committed she was to finding answers instead rather than preserving her reputation. As the problem grew out of control, what began as small annoyances swiftly turned into real problems as the degradation increased at an alarming rate, struggles that made my cozy suburbia neighbors more like survivors of natural disasters. I observed from my window as families started the degrading custom of begging acquaintances, while carrying buckets and containers, and family members for water to satisfy basic daily needs. Children were unable to take appropriate showers, and senior citizens struggled to meet basic hygienic demands, and young families were forced to limit their access to drinking water. The picture of Emma Patterson, 7, carrying a water bucket after a natural disaster, broke my heart. Despite the fact that the bucket was too large for her tiny hands. She didn't gripe after those 4 blocks with her grandma, who had previously chastised me for maintaining that antiquated pond were now looking in forlorn hope toward my house as Betty Campbell was one of the first to realize that they were waiting for a miracle that would allow them to resume their regular lives. A link between our water issue and the devastation of the pond, which she had grown up hearing about from her father's tales about the neighborhood's early growth, and she vaguely recalled his bringing up the pond, being incorporated into the well system. She showed up at my home on Thursday night with a distressed look, and Ash remarked softly as she settled into the ancient porch. Walt, a plastic water jug that symbolized her family's daily quota, chair, in which my grandpa formerly sat. I've been considering what my father used to say on the history of that pond. Is there a link between Cindy's actions and the state of our water supply? I examined her grizzled face for a while, realizing that this was the crucial time at which I had to decide whether to terminate Cindy. Stated that either education should be started early or it should be allowed to come to a disastrous end. Carefully, she will believe she nearly went into trouble rather than that she just wrecked a whole system if I save her now. With the insight of someone who has seen decades of local politics, Betty examined my expression and personal tragedies. But Walt, the old inhabitants are suffering while innocent people do not. It is not necessary for families with little children or those with health issues to learn this lesson about naturally. She was entirely correct about the individuals who were carrying the weight of Cindy's conceit were helpless victims who relied on their HOA leadership to make wise choices, and I was permitting their pain to proceed in order to educate one individual about the repercussions of acting without sufficient knowledge, even if I am aware that Itzy told Betty that I was selfish. But certain lessons can only be learnt by bearing the whole burden of their Cindy won't fully comprehend the repercussions if I step in too soon. When she refuses to answer questions, she has the power to ruin. That night, I sat next to my grandfather's picture and carried out the most challenging internal discussion of this whole situation. Grandpa, are I acting appropriately here? These decent folks are going through a lot of suffering because I'm attempting to educate Cindy about the risks of presuming I watched as neighbors helped one another while I gazed at the concrete slab where life-giving water had flowed. Carry water bottles in the encroaching darkness, and the neighborhood was coming together in ways I hadn't witnessed in a long time. However, by the end of day 2, Cindy, that solidarity had emerged from a situation that I could resolve with a single phone call, was putting in 18-hour stints in an effort to communicate with local authorities and find answers for our neighborhood. City Water Department checked their main distribution pipes and discovered an unexplained water scarcity. The regional utility company had examined its infrastructure and found that everything was operating within normal bounds. Discovered no systemic issues in their network, and everyone expert she spoke with gave the same perplexing response. Since there was no obvious issue with the municipal water supply, something had to be the cause of the situation. I saw her pacing wildly in her living room via my window, which was close to our neighborhood. Till almost midnight, most likely in an attempt to solve a riddle that, if she couldn't discover the solutions to, would ruin her reputation. Her light soon remained on into 2 in the morning, and I could see her figure retreating and forth like an animal in a cage, yearning to get out, and I wanted to march over there and put an end to her suffering instantly. But I also realized that tomorrow would be the day she would have to confront the full extent of she would learn more about leadership from that encounter than from any classroom or textbook ever could. So I made the heartbreaking decision that tomorrow would be the day I had to put an end to both our suffering and disclose the truth regardless of whether she would learn the desired lesson about accountability and the fatal consequences of day 3 brought the type of urgency that changes cozy suburban life into certainty without knowledge. Communities into disaster-like areas, with 58 of 80 homes being 21 more experienced low pressure for less than an hour and are now totally without water. Every day, and only a small number of homes at the far end of the community continued to experience anything like normalcy. Service, I observed how my neighborhood changed from a thriving middle-class neighborhood Tointo room, the lucky few who still had, working taps, senior citizens who had been living on their own for decades, suddenly discovered that they needed to rely on their younger neighbors for basic necessities, and their parents were keeping kids home from school due to their inability to uphold the appropriate cleanliness standards that Cindy was maybe working on 3 hours of sleep per night, and the tension that had built up was starting to manifest itself in everything from her unkempt due to her increasingly unpredictable decision-making. She had converted the local clubhouse into a temporary charts, monitoring water pressure measurements across the community contact lists at the emergency command center for each utility business in a 50-meter radius and an increasing number of grievances. From ever more needy, her continued lack of scapegoating and blame-shifting was what most struck me. Locals, even in the face of this unbearable pressure and the potential that her leadership would be viewed as a total disaster, yet she never wavered in her resolve to discover answers. Instead of preserving her image, but by Thursday afternoon, when nothing she had tried had generated even a slight improvement, I could see her starting to break under the extreme pressure, which is when about 48 hours later she recalled my dire prophecy, and all of a sudden I became the obvious suspect. In what she began to fear was intentional sabotage. She showed up to her deep voice trembled and her eyes went down. "You warned me about 48 hours, she murmured. Since there is now no water in the entire neighborhood." I welcomed her inside with the knowledge that this discussion would decide how I tried to say it as softly as possible. Miss Lockage, and the rest of this catastrophe unfolded for everyone concerned. Repeatedly to advise you to learn more about the role of that pawn before eliminating it. But you choose to ignore their advice. As an unimportant feeling, she gazed at me with increasing clarity and conviction. She muttered, "You knew this would happen." With terror on her face, "You purposefully failed to stop me." Her voice was heartbreakingly anguished, but I could also hear the first hints of true comprehension of cause and effect. "I warned you there would be repercussions for acting without appropriate investigation," I gently responded, attempting to persuade you to inquire and look for more details before you continued, without thinking that you could be overlooking important things, which shocked me. Totally and radically altered my opinion of Cindy's personality. Rather than making me defensive or attempting to assign blame on me, she fell into my kitchen chair like a pupil who has suddenly realized she had on the drive to school for her final exam. She started crying, not the self-pitying cries of someone feeling sorry for themselves, but the heartbroken sobs of someone who has just realized the full extent of their disastrous error. How many innocent people are suffering because I ignored her advice, because I was so conceited and unyielding. She wept as she described how many families lack access to basic essentials because I believed I knew better than everyone else. For the first time since this whole problem started, I truly felt sad for her, even if she was sobbing either. Because she was being punished, professionally, or because she had been found making mistakes, because she had at last realized that her actions had actually hurt innocent individuals who relied on her judgment. For the first time in our relationship, I addressed her by her first name, Cindy, saying, "You made a mistake, but it wasn't because of wickedness. Rather, it was because she was too sure she was correct." She gave me a crimson look. Can it really be healed with rimmed eyes and a face smeared with tears that conveyed sincere regret instead of self-pity? I didn't see the HOA president at the time, but there was a practical method to get everyone's water supply back. Despite my cautions, I witnessed a person frantically attempting to save something that she had unintentionally ruined, slowly nodded, feeling guilty about letting things get this far. "Yes, but you ought to be the first Simeon to share this tale with the community in order to restore their faith in your leadership." She dabbed at her eyes and straightened up with obvious difficulty, and I observed her gathering herself, using a mixture of willpower, and it was both sad and beautiful to see such humility. "Tell me what I need to accomplish," she said simply, with none of her previous authority but all of her previous determination. "I'll do anything time it takes to repair what I've damaged." That night, we both arranged an urgent community meeting for the Cindy. Spent the night before the next morning, getting ready for what would surely be her most challenging presentation. Professional career is not an attempt to downplay guilt nor a defense of her acts, but a thorough acknowledgement of her errors together with a thorough plan to correct them. I spent those coordinating all of my grandfather's technological records and getting ready to disclose the whole truth within the same hours regarding the pond's crucial role in the infrastructure of our community. Tomorrow would be the day when Earth community as a whole was taught painful lessons regarding the connection between well-meaning intentions and tragic outcomes, and regarding the crucial distinction between questioning leadership and leadership that misunderstands every solution. But tonight, for the first time since this situation started, I felt optimistic that something good would come of all this hardship. Not only a return of water pressure, but a renewed awareness of what true leadership entails. The truth would no longer be an option tomorrow. Would be essential. The emergency meeting on Friday morning attracted over 250. There is a standing room-only crowd of weary, irritated, and increasingly desperate residents in our clubhouse. The environment seemed very much like a trial, with residents demanding responsibility and prompt answers. At the same time that the defendant and the evidence were about to be disclosed, Cindy stood in the front of the room, appearing to in the last week. She had aged 10 years, and I was sitting in the back row with my laptop and a cardboard box that had my grandfather's historical records. The room was alive with irate conjecture and growing annoyance as individuals sought answers, and they wanted someone to take responsibility for 4 days of needless suffering. Cindy humiliated everyone in the room by taking full responsibility at the start of the meeting, prior to anybody accusing her of misconduct. I called this urgent meeting to acknowledge that I had made a horrible, unforgivable error that has truly hurt every family in our town, she added. Mr. Henderson's trembling voice, which could be heard clearly across the crowded room, sought to warn me about the repercussions of filling his pond, and I paid him no attention at all. I was so certain that I knew what was best for our community that I didn't bother to find out the pond's true function or get advice from others who could be more knowledgeable than I was. The room went utterly quiet while everyone attempted to comprehend this sudden admission of guilt. Mr. Henderson has knowledge that will detail my mistakes and the reasons why our community has been dealing with a water problem for the last 4 uncertain days. I carried my laptop, and my grandfather's well kept starting in 1952. I started extending my voice to fill the whole packed clubhouse. My grandpa collaborated closely with the head engineer of the city to create a thorough water the complete residential development's collection and distribution system. My grandfather's technical drawings were projected onto the wall, and subterranean channels that stretched from the pond all the way through without the pond to collect and transport water. The entire neighborhood would function similarly to blood arteries in a living body. The crowd's response was instantaneous. When those wells gradually but unavoidably dried up through the system, and visceral. Some individuals clenched their hands or breathed deeply, while others hung their heads as though they were awakening from a lengthy slumber. Children's hands tighter when a woman in the front row recalled that her child needed to take a bath. She started weeping. With bottled water for 2 days. There was simply stillness and a shared realization, no shouts or applause, because most people appeared to have been blind for much too long, rather than focusing their rage only on Cindy. Truly astounded by the intricacy and refinement of the infrastructure system they were unaware of. You mean this entire neighborhood has been operating on a water distribution system for decades under their feet? From 1952? A local exclaimed, and none of us knew it existed at all. Another neighbor held up her hand and said, "Why wasn't this system more important to the existence of our community?" Adequately recorded in a location that the HOA's leadership could readily access. I observed that the society was starting to recognize that this wasn't just a single individual making a disastrously poor choice that concerned historical data and institutional knowledge that had been eroded over time as fresh families arrived in without knowing about their neighborhood's history and elderly ones moved away. Cindy, the hidden infrastructure, came up once again, and I saw her mustering all of her might for the worst thing about her public admission was that, in all honesty, I should have asked a lot more questions and it a lot more in depth, studied before drastically altering our community since I was so keen on demonstrating my ability to make improvements and exercise good leadership. Despite not giving enough thought to what was necessary, Mr. Henderson attempted to educate me on the roles we could be losing, and Mrs. Campbell recommended more research, and I rejected them both because I believed my history in the workplace and my good intentions were enough stop to see the looks of the neighbors who had been rationing shower time and bringing water buckets around the room. I let my pride and need to be correct to overcome my basic principles for 4 days. Betty Campbell took charge of her duty to use caution and diligence. While making judgments that have an impact on everyone, she shouted something that shocked everyone in the room from her place in the center, but it's not totally Cindy is to blame, and we must all admit that we have allowed convenience to prevent us from becoming inquisitive. We always laughed it off when someone brought up this location's past. But today when the water stopped running, wouldn't know why. It wasn't a lack of knowledge, but rather a loss of recollection. She surveyed the space with the seasoned insight of someone who has experienced decades of communal life. Despite the political upheavals and changes, Walt attempted to retain institutional memory and information that the rest of us, some of us, chastised him for being mired in the past, rather than embracing progress because he had forgotten or never learned. Perhaps this circumstance teaches us all valuable lessons about the need of respecting others and asking inquiries. Historically, the emotional tone of the gathering drastically changed from one of rage and finger-pointing to one of people who were forward-thinking, cooperative, and considerate. Started posing useful queries regarding logistics and answers. How much would it actually cost to repair the pond and how long would it take? While we were upgrading the water distribution system, I had the opportunity to work closely with Cindy to respond to these inquiries, and I saw that she was at last posing the types of thorough, before making her initial choice, she ought to have asked research-oriented inquiries. And I shared the good news with the gathering is that I can provide our whole neighborhood with water from a deep well as a backup source while the reconstruction process will take around 8 weeks to finish the pond restoration and will cost about $18,000, which I'm willing to pay for myself, because being more proactive may have avoided this situation about expressing what I know rather than allowing conceit and obstinacy to control my behavior. That night, Cindy and I sat silently together, examining the old designs and letting out a sigh. Neither of us said anything, but both of us realized that tomorrow would bring with it a new type of work, not only repairing a pond, but restoring trust, restoration, comprehension, and the links between the past and future that sustain communities. The next Monday morning, the project got underway, and over the next few weeks, something that I hadn't expected Cindy and I to have a sincere collaboration, that developed into the most productive and cooperative. Cindy provided our HOA with the most leadership she had ever had, project management expertise, coordination abilities, and organizational capabilities with contractors and local officials, as I provided historical and technical knowledge of our water systems and relationships with those who recalled how things used to operate. We worked side by side, alongside in the dirt and dust from the concrete, meticulously extracting each fragment of the solidified cement that had buried when we discovered the child's hair clip. Cindy, who was a grandpa's engineering masterpiece, started sobbing one afternoon. Who knew that each shovelful of concrete could weigh so much, she muttered softly, buried beneath the layer of concrete. Because of physics, but also because of meaning, I just nodded and gave her another I assumed. I understood what she said as she fell with her hands on her knees, and her face covered in muck next to the edge of the pond. Without glancing at me, I said, paper, as all I understood was only on paper, can't retain water. With a painfully relieved laugh, she said, now I see why your grandfather excavated this by hand. Some items must be handled to comprehend their way of life. I saw her change from someone who always asked questions and actually listened, as opposed to someone who made choices all by himself, though the responses Discovering that being a leader means comprehending the process of rebuilding the pond turned into an unanticipated local education initiative that united our community in several ways that, after decades of social gatherings, folks who had never considered infrastructure or municipal engineers discovered that they were studying subterranean distribution lines, water tables, and the sensitive equilibrium of interrelated systems that maintained the smooth operation of their cozy suburbia lifestyle. 3 generations collaborated on restoration, each bringing their own special talents to create a living classroom, viewpoints, and abilities to reconstruct something that took decades to comprehend and minutes to destroy on a rainy day. Everyone put on plastic hats and continued working, but a young child splashed and the old man standing close by stated, "I'm doing what my great-grandpa used to do." Puddles by the pond's edge grinned and said that he had really assisted in digging the first pond years prior. Nobody else knew this except I was the only one who could still recognize his face from stacks of old photos. As time passed in that muck, I realized that we weren't only rescuing a system. Rather, we were repairing it. On the elementary school whiteboard, a youngster depicted the pond and wrote the lines, "Where my grandpa got water for baths." During that day's parent meeting, every student came up to share tales of the perhaps the most valuable lessons come from the words of the youngest among us teens who served at Forgotten Pond. To assist with the heavy effort of clearing trash and removing concrete, senior citizens shared forgettenals of the neighborhood's early growth that gave us insight into how different customs and institutions may require care, recording, or preservation for next generations. 3. A startling event occurred weeks into the rehabilitation process, demonstrating how thoroughly Cindy's attitude to leadership has changed. She added, removing her work gloves following an especially demanding day 05, been giving careful consideration to how we may avoid this type of disastrous situation with excavation and concrete removal. What if we established a permanent neighborhood history and infrastructure to prevent this error from occurring again in the future? Committee that records all institutional knowledge and system traditions that maintain the efficient operation of our community, not only the water distribution system, but everything that before making significant modifications, new residents and future HOA boards should comprehend that it was precisely the type of I had thought she would use this to construct the forward-thinking, collaborative, historically informed approach that and pleasant experience. But watching her make the proposal entirely on her own initiative surpassed my most hopeful hopes. The new pond that finally emerged from our arduous restoration effort was really a big improvement over we used contemporary filtering technology in my grandfather's original design while preserving all the conventional water distribution and collection services that had supported our community for 4 decades. We put up educational signs and plaques that explained how the main reason the method functioned was so that future people would know what they were looking at and why it was significant. We put in place thorough maintenance guidelines and documentation practices to stop the type often weeks following that initial shovel. The institutional knowledge that had initially enabled this disaster was lost. Concrete was dumped into my grandfather's pond, and the water started to return to the completely repaired ecology. The first trickle sounded like our entire neighborhood coming alive again after months of holding its breath. Young goldfish were swimming in pristine water in only a few days, and every home in for the first time since the crisis started. Our village got full water pressure. But the true triumph wasn't only our community's approach to decision-making. Completely changed when our water supply was restored. Cindy was reelected with overwhelming support for her leadership duties and commitment to institutional knowledge preservation. 6 months later, she ran for HOA president, but this time she ran on a platform of cooperative leadership through research and the preservation of institutional knowledge as opposed to quick efficiency and modernization. I took on the recently established role of technical and historical advisor, which helped to bridge the distance between younger families that brought new ideas and older inhabitants who recalled how things used to function. The points on how to enhance procedures and systems. Betty Campbell became our official community historian. entrusted with recording all the tailies, customs, and technical details of the water distribution system. Information that enabled our neighborhood to operate as a true community, instead of merely a group of Henderson Community Pond, is currently marked with a bronze plaque, serving as a reminder that work has been made, implies comprehending the past before creating the future. But the true monument to this whole event is fundamental shift in our community's decision-making process before any significant changes. Ara suggested that we investigate the historical background, offer thorough inquiries, and for our first goals, we confer with others who may have information that we do not, which we have acquired by difficult experience. Simply having excellent intentions alone is insufficient. You also need to be brave, wise, humble, and intellectually curious. To be honest, Cindy and I still sit by the pond every evening to observe the water when we don't know something crucial. Flow, and talking about the lessons we've learned about community duty, leadership, and the risky on other days. Cindy takes a thermos of tea to avoid the temptation to think, you know things better than you actually do. We don't talk as we approach the pond's edge. Instead, we only listen to the water's slow, soft ripples as a silent apology that unaware of what formerly existed. The new fish continued to swim in the sunset light. Occurred here, and maybe, like kids, they only need to understand that the water has returned, and after the water started flowing again, I came to the stunning realization that not all crises must be corrected right away. Other classes call for having the offending party hear the sound of water fading, and only then, when I conclude sharing, will they really see the significance of what they nearly lost forever, hearing that same life-giving water running through the subterranean pipes under our. Tell me in the comments if you have ever had to link the neighborhood that connects each home to the source that keeps us all alive. Learn a challenging lesson about the repercussions of action without enough knowledge. Have you ever been in a circumstance when confidence and good intentions resulted in unanticipated harm that may have been prevented with more inquiries and less presumptions? Because at the end of the day, we are all simply neighbors attempting to look out for one another and our communities. Home, and occasionally allowing someone to feel the inevitable results of their actions is the greatest way to teach them choices while being available to assist them in rebuilding when they're ready to seek advice. Thank you for observing Clueless Stories. Please press the like button if you like this one, and remember to subscribe for more crazy stories in the future. Your